Hello and welcome to this video on the AJH Synth Next Phase. Let's check out what's to come before we get into it. Now the next phase is the successor and upgrade to the mega phase. Now the first and big upgrade is there's much less noise on the next phase. Now to me that wasn't an issue because anytime I stamp on something like this, classic phaser pedal, I expect to hear some swooshing. The next phase though is much quieter than anything else other than just plain DSP software. We have two inputs. These are mono inputs, but we've got two of them with level controls. We do have stereo left and right outs, which tap their points from the different poles in the phasing or from the resonance path. We have a fully wet out, which isn't ever a mix out like the left and right is, controlled by the depth. We have an onboard triangle LFO. You can see that there on the LED, which we can take out of the module. The LFO normals to frequency CV1 with an attenuator. We can override that with an input. There's a second frequency input with a attenuverter. We can control the depth with a CV. We can also control the emphasis with a CV. So we have frequency controls. We can select multiple stages on this phasing. We can tap a different emphasis and resonance path, creating lots of different phase cancellations, lots of different tones. And that way we can model all these different classic phasers that are 4-pole or 8-pole phasers. It's kind of all in there. We have a color control that just quite subtly shifts the color. It's quite obvious in stereo. So let's check out the next phase. We'll go in stereo. So of course, make sure you've got headphones or some decent speakers on. And we'll plug in a saw wave and a bit of noise. So, kind of cancelling everything out. There's our inputs coming through. Depth up full, and we get this blend of the phasing. Deep, rich analogue phasing. Notice how things like the low end's changing. The stereo image changes. As we tap different resonance points and use different amounts of poles for the phasing, because these are different on the left and right outs. The emphasis is resonance. And there's plenty of it when you want that really resonant, deep kind of phase sound. The onboard LFO goes to frequency CV input 1. Goes nice and slow. Two, certainly as fast as I'd want for standard phaser stuff. And you've got those inputs for audio rate modulation, sample and hold, whatever you want to throw at it. So the range of LFO movement is on the attenuator. And I'll just take that noise out. That's really there for mojo. It's really clean, crisp phasing. And removing that, it's super quiet. Certainly for an analog phaser, I think it's the quietest I must have heard. Bit of noise for character. And that's a kind of quick tour of the next phase. I've got lots of different patches. We're going to kind of abuse it musically, push it with audio rate modulation. And as I said, you can check out that mega phase video, which is the predecessor to the next phase, should you want a bit more after this one. Let's get into it. So in this patch, the noise and effects you hear, this sound, is all entirely secondary to the next phase. So let's kill that for now. And here's my stereo out of the next phase. And it just sounds glorious. It's two AJH mini-mod oscillators playing different melodies, a melodic part and a kind of counter bass line into the mini-mod ladder filter, which if I just turn the depth down and give it a sweep, just sounds ace. Now let's drop this down an octave, because who doesn't love bass? So turning up the depth and opening the filter a bit more, so next phase has more to play with. Now the left and right stereo is going into the mixer. That's what we're recording entirely dry as you hear it. The wet out is feeding a noisy PT delay and some reverbs, giving us this dirty background mono texture that I'm going to mix underneath the dry stereo out on the next phase. And there's not much to show with the next phase other than it sounds really good over this patch. So in this patch, I wanted to show phasing moving wavetable tones, but also using that second input to add some noise back into the phaser. Every analog phaser pedal and bit of gear that I use has this hiss and this constant kind of sound, because they're slightly noisy circuits. That's just what phasers are. And because the next phase is much quieter, I actually wanted some of that noise back in for the character of the sound. But in this case, the phaser is before a VCA, so I'm cutting that noise in and out rather than having this constant hiss all the way through the patch. Now I'll cut down everything else. And let's open this VCA wide open. It'll get a little bit louder, so watch your ears. Now let's kill the phasing and turn that second input down. Here's a wavetable chord tone, and phasing that on its own sounds great. This is going into a little delay, but adding that noise in just means the phaser's always got something to chew on. It just works so well with that noise in there. So putting this into a VCA that I'm kind of chopping up with an envelope. I want that noise even louder. Emphasis higher than I'd normally have it, because it's just giving these little percussive hits with that chordal tone and the noise, giving that phaser lots to move and modulate around. With the backing drums and little bass line stuff. Gives us these great little phased hits that have been cut up by the VCA after the next phase in the patch. More emphasis, more noise, just works really well. So here we've got the Minimod sample, hold and slew next to the next phase, kind of driving the whole show. Dividers, modulation, everything you're hearing. And here's the dry beat, unaffected by next phase. It's going into some compression, and the next phase is going to mix in pre-compression to kind of squash all this together. And we're going to use the next phase to create this moving, modulated texture in the background. And it's going to start out fairly subtle. So I'm going to bring in the mix of the next phase. And this is taking a mix of the whole thing and going into the next phase. Have some sample and hold, driving the second CV input. You can hear this kind of resonant texture moving around in the background. I'm going to run that into some reverb as well, and then it's going to go next phase, reverb, into the mixer with the drum sounds that are feeding this whole thing, like a send effect. Now it's still fairly subtle, but when I add some smooth LFO movement from the internal LFO, it becomes a little bit more obvious. It's just a patch to show that rather than just phasing the whole thing, in this case phasing over some percussion and drum beats, you could create a send effect, phase this drum beat. I'm coming out fully wet, so I'm not mixing any dry back in. This goes into some reverb, back into the mixer. It's all squashed together, and it gives us this resonant, phased, reverberant backdrop while the beats stay nice and dry and present in your face. So in this patch, we've really kind of pushed and abused the next phase with audio rate modulation to give us this rather dissonant, clangorous set of tones. Now the dissonant element comes from the unquantized sequences that I'm using to modulate the audio rate modulation sources, but removing those, we get some glorious audio rate overtones. So here's one Minimod oscillator saw wave into next phase, and then another one modulating the frequency input, the second one. And I've simply tuned in the audio rate source to give us some more harmonious audio rate overtones. Now modulating the modulating oscillator, some interesting overtones to be had. But taking it a bit further, I have a looping envelope, which is a maths module just off screen, into the depth modulation, and here's that modulation added. So let's remove this oscillator from modulating the frequency, and here's just the depth modulation. Again, some really nice overtones. Mix them together. A nice kind of chordal audio rate like overtone. Now sequencing these is where we get this kind of unquantized dissonance. One sequence to the depth modulation source and one to the frequency modulation source. But again, without the modulation, it's a really nice set of overtones. You could sequence all of this, run it through filters, low pass gates, whatever you want, create percussion with it. It just responds nicely to audio rate modulation. So here we're going to look at pinging the next phase. And to ping Something is commonly done with a filter, and we get a filter very near oscillation, so we drop the resonance just below the point that that filter oscillates, ping the input with a trigger, the audio input with a trigger this is, and it just excites that circuit because it's nearly oscillating, and we get a little clav-like or clave-like little percussive sound. So I have a trigger here on the scope, the green trace coming to the input. I'm taking stereo out. The wet out is just going into the scope, so we can see that on the blue trace. Let's take the emphasis up full and the depth up full as well. So because the emphasis is so high, it's nearly oscillating at the frequency set with the frequency knob. And of course, with the stage selection and the emphasis stage selection, there's a lot of range and scope and differing kind of little oscillating sounds. So that's a thick low end in that, like a bass drum almost. So there's a couple of things I thought I'd try with that. The first being FMing it, seeing what that sounds like. So let's take an oscillator into the frequency CV, turn that up. And there's some nice FM tones, but a little bit of bleed through as well, so you'd maybe want a low pass gate after this, then strike that as well if you're going for these FM phaser pings for your patch. We could try audio rate modulation of the depth, taking us from the trigger sound to the now pinged next phase. Kind of amplitude modulation for the wet sound. And if I start to sequence the source that I'm using for audio rate modulation, lots of little cool pings and very West Coasty FM wave-shaped folded like tones start to come out. Losing that for now, we could modulate frequency with, say, sample and hold. And I should say we could use the colour to mess around with the stereo image. This is in stereo, so make sure you've got some headphones on or some decent speakers. Just take the modulation off. You can sense that stereo image start to change, especially in headphones. With the sample and hold controlling the frequency, let's get this modulated audio rate source into depth. And you wouldn't think that was coming out of a phaser. So here's a stereo patch with the next phase. I've got AJH modules, including the oscillator and the sonic diode ladder filter, just out of shot, so it's a great sound up front. This is going through some delay and a little bit of spring reverb before coming into the next phase. Coming out in stereo, so make sure you've got headphones on or some decent speakers, and it's just absolutely lush. I'm using the internal LFO as well as some heavily slewed sample and hold from the mini mod. It's just absolutely gorgeous. Now that colour control, as subtle as it is, has a nice effect between us panning these two outputs hard left and right. It's different on each side. So to finish on, I wanted to make a patch that was a bit bigger, use more of the AJH modules, a bit of drums back in, some effects, but importantly uses that wet output through this fixed filter bank 914 module, giving us a kind of double layer of shaping. Now I'll remove my effects and drums, delay back, and a bit of reverb. This is simply coming into channel 1, stereo out. Now have the triangle wave from the oscillator into input 2, again creating another layer and more depth and interest. So turning that triangle up, we could just hear this drawn through while these pulse waves that are being pulse width modulated on these oscillators through the ring SM for some subgeneration and through the filter kind of play away against it. There's the main sound again. Blending a bit of triangle back. Just to get a bit more depth. Now the wet output, and importantly the wet output because it is just the wet phased sound, not the blended control, the mix out that we control with the depth on the left and right. And this, I say importantly because it mixes back in with the sound differently than just blending more of that dry sound or now processed dry back in. It's just the wet phase sound into the fixed filter bank. So we've got a kind of double layer of animation between the phaser and the filter bank. I'm modulating between the left and the right bands, which I've made sound very different. And also between the dry and the wet. So just moving between those bands. We can hear this LFO moving between left and right bands on this mix output. And then another LFO to dry wet. Gives us 2 points of animation on the filter bank, a ton of tonal scaping. Go check out the video demo for that in the description when you finish watching this one, of course. I'm bringing back the sound coming straight from the next phase in stereo. We've just got this lovely, thick, rich, animated sound. And having this secondary processed layer through the filter bank works great because we can just use that to feed the effects. In this case, the stereo reverb that just came in. And having these two layers works great because we can use the fixed filter bank to feed the effects. So the effects are getting a different signal to the main stereo sound. Again, this one. It gives those effects more depth, some tonal differences, and we've got all these tonal animated shifts from the filter bank as well. So together it gives us this lovely, thick, analogue processed, lot of AJH goodness. I'm usually a little bit gushy in the AJH videos. Some drums. And that's our patch. Check out the other AJH Synth videos linked in the description. Hit like, comment, subscribe. Cheers for watching. Patreon.com/DivKid if you want to support the work that I do. Check out more videos below. Have a nice day.